Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
There's been a lot of political change since we last talked with Dr. Namrata Goswami, both domestically and on the world stage. Dr. Goswami is an author and educator, and currently she teaches with the West Space and Shriver Scholars Program at Johns Hopkins University. She co-authored the book Scramble for the Skies, the Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space. And for some reason that I can't quite explain, she's been a frequent guest on the Terra podcast. But in any case, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Goswami back to the program. Namrata, it's great to see you again.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be back.
I want to talk, first of all, just kind of a 30,000-foot view of things. How do you see the current geopolitical tensions affecting international space collaboration?
Sure. So before I answer that question, I need to issue a disclaimer.
Sure.
So everything I say today is my own opinion and does not represent the perspective of the U.S. Space Force or the U.S. Air Force or the Department of Defense. Now, having got that out of the way, so in terms of the larger perspective on what is happening in terms of geopolitics and space, there are actually 4 critical developments. One is that what I'm noticing in terms of patterns and trends theoretically is that there is a great focus on most major nations trying to develop a very clear idea of what space means in terms of their grand strategic posture. So what does that mean? So the second part of the answer would be that means that nations are starting to invest in their space industrial base, which includes their civil, military, as well as commercial, or in China's perspective, private space sector funded by the state-owned enterprises. The third interesting trend is that nations are now starting to view space beyond just Earth orbit to include the space between the Earth and the Moon and deep space missions like asteroid exploration and mining, as well as what that means. For example, if you have a presence on Mars. And then finally, what is the most interesting development is that nations around the world are starting to observe this in terms of major power behavior and are establishing their own space agencies and programs. So today we have about 76 nations that have established their own space program, compared to, say, about 5 space programs that we can think of during the Cold War. So those are the very interesting high-level conceptual trends that I'm observing as I study this interesting terrain.
So you talk about those nations that have space programs, but they're not all involved in launch activities. It's not always about somebody who can put a rocket in space.
That's correct. So the current model in terms of the post-Cold War is that there are some nations, as you said, that have launch capability. So one, of course, is the United States, Russia, China, India, Japan. South Korea has developed their own launch capability as well. But what is changed from the Cold War is that nations are starting to think about space from an economic, cost-effective, model. And so what they're doing is that they are actually utilizing the launch capabilities available. They buy it, and then they use those launches. For example, SpaceX's Falcon 9, India's geosynchronous launch vehicle or polar satellite launch vehicle, Japan's rockets, the H2 series. And so what they're doing is that they're buying those services. So yeah, correct. There is only a few nations have launched, but other nations are utilizing those launch for their satellites launch capability.
How is the ISAR aerospace launch program going to affect that? I know they had an attempt on Sunday that was not terribly successful, although they said it met all of their mission objectives. But that's going to put a European launch provider on the market as well. How might that change the landscape?
So you're referring to ISRO, the Indian space program?
No, the ISAR aerospace, the German company that launched from Norway on Sunday.
Oh, I haven't seen that, Tom.
Oh.
Yeah,
okay.
I haven't seen that particular news item. But anyway, conceptually, and if what I hear what you say is that that's going to achieve 2 things if the launch has been successful. One is that Europe has been trying very hard to develop their own indigenous launch capability. So Ariane rocket, from France is one of the
Mm-hmm.
major rockets that they have been developing. The idea is that because there is difficulty, for example, that is emerging in the EU-US relationship, so they're hoping that they have their own ecosystem. So if the German company successfully launched, it means that they are also having commercial capability, which they have been trying to develop.
Well, they launched for about 30 seconds, and then the rocket came back and experienced what they call at SpaceX a RUD, a rapid unscheduled disassembly. But I'm glad you just took a Sunday off and weren't paying attention to the news yesterday.
Yeah, I didn't see that particular piece of news.
How will the Trump administration, obviously we've had a change in administration since we talked last, and how will this iteration of the Trump administration, do you think, affect the geopolitics of space?
Yeah, so the Trump administration 2.0 is very new, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
It's just come into office in January. So if I can think about what are the clues that we get from Trump 1.0, for example, the first administration in terms of space. So that particular administration put out a lot of space policy documents. There were, I think, about 4 focus areas of the Trump administration at that time. One was, of course, to build a U.S. commercial space sector with very supportive regulatory structures, so very clear regulatory capabilities that actually support the commercial space activities. Second, there was a lot of focus on building American launch capabilities, not just Falcon 9, but also Starship, for example, and the space launch capability. The third interesting, you can see from Trump 1.0, is that there was a lot of focus on building permanent capabilities, for example, not just in low Earth orbit, but also the moon, and also to recognize the importance of, for example, such capabilities for US power projection. And then finally, in Trump 1.0, there was, of course, the establishment of an institutional military structure called the US Space Force and the US Space Command that was brought back, the command that Bush had kind of done away with. So George Bush Jr. So taking clues from that, I think there are 2 patterns I see emerging geopolitically. One is that there will be a focus on building US defense and offensive space capability for defense of the homeland geopolitically. There is a big concern you can hear from the Trump administration with China's intercontinental ballistic missiles, hypersonics, for example. So the one thing that came out was a Golden Dome memo, if you have seen it, the executive order, where the Trump administration has tasked the Pentagon to provide the architecture for a space-based interceptor capability that can actually counter missiles and through radar and sensors. So that's one. The second important thing that I see is that there is going to be the building of partnerships with strategic allies and partners like India. So there is a lot of focus on building India-US defense space capability. Where do I get this data? So Prime Minister Modi visited President Trump in his second term in February, and they signed a joint statement, which is interesting. The joint statement, besides other things, focused on building partnerships, including building defense-based partnership. So that's where I think it is going. And China is seen as a peer competitor.
When you talk about the Golden Dome, has the technology, in your opinion, changed enough since the days of SDI under Ronald Reagan that it might actually be feasible this time?
Yeah, so it's a good question to ask. So when I look at the literature, for example, from that time and forward, several thinkers in the US pointed out that there are 2 different schools of thought, right? One school of thought is that one is the technology, one is the implication of say a SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, ballistic missile defense. One is that the arms control school and is a very strong school in US strategic thinking that points out that even if you have the technology and the capability, a system that is based in space, that has interceptors that can intercept from space, could be escalatory, right? So their whole focus is that space is stable because we do not have such presence in space. And so BMD, a ballistic missile system that is in space, could be destabilizing. Now, there is a weapons school system and thinking that argues that, well, actually, if you build such a capability, it's going to offer a very clear defense of the homeland, as well as defense of allies. For example, Japan is concerned about North Korean rockets falling into Japanese soil that falls into the Sea of Japan. And so a missile system like that, that is global in nature, could offer a shield or a deterrence. So to answer your question more specifically, what do I think of the technology, right? So ballistic missile system as envisioned by the executive order is not just about intercepting missiles, say example, when it is beyond launch, right? The system also envisions targeting missiles at the boost phase. And the boost phase is vital because it's before, say, multiple warheads have taken off. So you're actually countering it at the phase when it's launching. I would argue that the computer systems, the sensors, the technology has advanced a lot after the Cold War, right? At the time when Reagan was thinking about it. So we have the computing, because, for example, for hypersonics, because it's so fast, you will have to have very, very receptive sensors and capability. So for that, we need very high level computing and the data. And so I think in my perspective, we are there today. The only challenge would be the cost of it, right? So in my conversations, I haven't got a very clear idea of how much it's going to cost. What I hear is that, okay, it'll cost billions of dollars, but I have not got a very exact figure as yet. So the technology is advanced and mature today. The one thing that the Trump administration will have to work out, because they're so much focused on cost-effective building of capability, that the costs do not exceed the advantages that we get from such a system.
Let's come back and talk about kind of what a lot of people think of as the big three, Russia, China, and India, when it talks about competitors in space. And tell me what you're seeing regarding their respective space programs.
Yeah, oh, that's a fantastic question. That's the heart of my work, right? I'm passionate about it. So in my research following these countries for the last about 20 years, so what I do is that I look at, for example, China, India, Russia space program from what they're hoping to achieve. So when I talk about space policy and space theory, especially space power theory, I focus on what is that nation hoping to achieve from the development of their space capability. That is vital. So let's take China, and I'll end with Russia. So when you look at China's space program, the focus of China's space program since Mao Zedong to President Xi Jinping has been that space technology, for example, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, targeting, missile tracking, nuclear command and control, communications, navigation, Earth-Moon system presence, is about projecting and improving Chinese power projection capability. So which means that space is viewed as supporting not just ground joint military deployment and extension of power. It's about also extending that power to space. So in that context, what I see in China's space program, beg your pardon, is that they are doing three interesting things. One is that they are improving their presence in low Earth orbit through, for example, mega constellation structures that helps communication, navigation, tracking of missile. They're including their space control, for example, the access to space through launch capability, diversified launch, by which I mean they have rockets that use liquid fuel, but they also have rockets that use solid fuel. And then launch, what is interesting is that besides ground-based launch, they're also building their mobile sea-based launch capability. So that's a very diversified launch capability. Second, what they're doing is that they're also building their infrastructure in cislunar space, which is Earth and the Moon. And then finally, what they're doing is that they are actually coming up with timelines for deep space missions as well. So it's a very holistic program for China. Right. For India, what is interesting is that in the last few years, India's program historically has been very traditional. It's about building satellites for weather forecasting, for agriculture yield, for helping farmers understand where crops are best grown, e-education. And so now they have moved from that traditional perspective. Now, India's space program is trying to catch up with China, for example, building launch capability. India just announced that they'll build a heavy lift rocket. You talked about launch. So India is They want to also build reusability. Both China and India are focused on that. They're not there yet, right? So in reusability capability. And then India is also starting to argue that, well, we also need to build presence in low Earth orbit with our own space station. We need to build lunar habitation, and they have come up with timelines. And then also Mars mission. And India also recently started talking about the critical importance of command of space and space control. By command of space, what I mean theoretically is that there are certain regions in space that are extremely vital for your access. One is low Earth orbit. There are choke points, the Lagrange points for Earth Moon system, and then Lagrange points for Sun Earth system, right? India has a mission in Lagrange 1, Sun Earth Lagrange point 1. It's called the Aditya mission. It's a mission that is studying the sun. And so that's where India's program is going. Russia, again, an interesting, very, very major space power. What I noticed from Russia's space program is that what it is perceiving as its grand strategic focus is that space should enable Russia's military operations on Earth, which means they're focusing a lot on low Earth orbit, very cheap satellites that can help in that kind of communication, navigation, tracking. Their focus on the moon and Mars is somehow losing that particular historical focus that the Soviet Union have. And they are actually collaborating with China in this regard. So they're signing agreements with China and kind of building capability in collaboration with China.
So do Russia and China really get along, or is this just a geopolitical convenience? And do you feel like it's going to last?
So to answer your question, we have to go back about 20 years, right?
Okay.
So in some sense, when I hear analysis of Russia-China relationship, the overarching framework that most Western analysts takes, and I use that term because there's a lot of analysis in Western sources, that this is a relationship of convenience and it's not going to last, right? But then when you look at, so then you need to dig deeper. What are these countries actually saying? What are their sources actually saying? So the interesting point is that China around 2000, under Hu Jintao, who was at that time the president of the People's Republic of China, pointed out that one of the most important relationships for China is Russia. And this is not just based on communist ideology, which was historically with the Soviet Union. This is actually very practical because China has requirements that Russia can fulfill. For example, import of oil, which Russia has. Technology. Russia is still a leader in technology, including military weapon systems and structures, and space is one of them, right? So fast forward, what I'm noticing is that despite Russia's invasion of Ukraine, despite Russia's activities, for example, in terms of low Earth orbit, China has taken a decision that this relationship is too important for China. And so I would predict that the relationship will last so long as both nations, and that's why that grand strategic focus is vital. Both nations have a grand strategic focus that their coming together is offering an alternative perspective to the world. And as long as they continue with that, they're going to be together. Is my
So how did their respective economies get involved in that, though? Because there's a lot of analysis that says both Russia's and China's economy are pretty weak right now. How is that going to affect what they're doing?
So when we think about the economic analysis of China and Russia space program, overall, if you think about what's happening in China, for example, inflation, problems with real estate, Russia too, Russia's economy doing as well. Overall, the analysis would be that, well, this would mean that their space programs might also suffer, right? But the data does not support, for example, with China's space program. So, and this is a very interesting phenomenon that I'm starting to study. So India too, for example, historically, because India had such problems with poverty and the economy, the argument was that India might not be able to sustain such a high-end space program, but India has. So the answer is that space is seen as so vital for example, for China's economic development, for China's capacity in terms of its own focus on other technologies like artificial intelligence, robotics, their economy, that they find the money. and they find very long-term money. And so what they do is that, especially for China, India, and Russia to an extent, Russia is actually facing much more issues than China and India in terms of the funding for its program. And you can see that, right, in terms of some of the failures that Russia had with Luna 25. Just, I think, last month, or this month, early this month, Russia changed the head of its Roscosmos space agency and
Mhm.
have a new leader now. So, and they argued that, well, innovation was a problem, budgetary issues were a problem. So they're acknowledging that. So I would argue that both China, India have allocated money in their 5-year plans for their space programs. And because they give such high priority that they find the money for it.
When it comes to India and China, is it fair to say that India's space program is kind of the tortoise to China's hare when it comes to the rate at which they are moving?
Historically, yes. So, and I have argued this in a piece I wrote on the difference between India and China's space strategy, but India is starting to become much more confident, right?
Hmm.
So, China has been ahead of India in when we talk about just space capacity, right? One is launch capability. China is ahead. China's Long March 5 can take about 25 tons to low Earth orbit. India's geosynchronous GS-SLV Mark 3 can take about 6 tons, which is much lower to low
Right.
Earth orbit. China has announced a Long March 9 project, which is reusable, that is going to take about 140 metric tons to low Earth orbit, very similar to Starship. And the launch date is 2030, right? So, yeah. So, and then the second area where India is behind is, of course, heavy lift rocket, the capability to
Hmm.
launch much more for a cheaper cost. Low Earth orbit constellation structures. China is starting to build their low Earth orbit constellation. And the reason is because China had taken this decision 5 years ago that they are going to build those structures. India hasn't taken such a decision. India has a navigation structure, but it's not the mega constellations like Starlink and what China is hoping to achieve. So India is behind. India is really behind when it comes to military space architecture. China
Hmm.
has about 250 military satellites, very close to the United States in low Earth orbit. China has geosynchronous capability, now a presence in cislunar space. India has not even built those capability. And then finally, China has a permanent space station called the Tiangong Space Station in low Earth
Hmm.
orbit. India does not. India has announced that they're going to build their own space station by 2028. They'll start that. But you see, China took that decision much ahead. And then finally, China, along with the US and the Soviet Union and Russia, have a human spaceflight program. They have
Right.
showcased the capability to take humans to low Earth orbit. India hasn't as yet. I will end by saying that one thing that has changed the conversation in India is that after the success of their landing on the not on the southern hemisphere of the moon
Hmm.
in 2023, India's confidence has increased. And as you said, it took a long time to build that capacity because India's space capability is very much built in house. And so now, what is interesting is that India is starting to come up with very bullish, ambitious deadlines. For example, 2040, India wants to have a permanent presence on the moon. 2030, India wants to have its own space station and human spaceflight program, hopefully by 2030 again. So again, you see India is starting to catch up, but not yet there.
I'm talking with Dr. Namrata Goswami on the Terra podcast. Take a moment right now to click subscribe so you don't miss any of our podcasts, or if you're watching on YouTube, any of the videos from Terra, the Journal of Space Commerce. And please consider becoming a paid subscriber. Whether you're a space professional or an enthusiast, paid subscribers have first access to premium articles and podcasts focused on the new space economy. Just visit xterrajsc.com and help keep the Journal of Space Commerce independent as we chronicle, cajole, and when necessary, critique the commercial space industry. Let's look a little bit more at the commercial space industry aspect of it, Namrata, and talk about some of the biggest international challenges that are facing the commercial space industry.
Yeah, so if you look at the commercial space industry, I would say that there are about two challenges that it faces. One is, of course, funding challenges, right? So what is interesting is that when you look at the framework in the media, especially in the American media and the global media, there seems to be a lot of focus on the big companies, right? For example, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, historically. Now, of course, the new space companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin. And some of them have funding, they have their own funding as well. But when it comes to the larger space economy and space startups and commercial space sector, funding is still an issue, especially committed funding, because space technology takes time. Some of the nations, what they're interestingly doing is that they're announcing sovereign wealth funds, for example, or a particular fund absolutely focused on the commercial space sector. India just announced that with a 53 million space fund for its own commercial space sector. But then you'll have to scale it up if you're thinking about launch, reusability, mega constellation. These are expensive things, right? So that's one. The second thing that the commercial space sector is facing historically and now is sometimes the lack of regulatory structures that can offer especially private companies assured return on investment, because there is ambiguity as to the legality of the private space sector. For example, if we have, say, a resource extraction, say on the moon, right? But there is no clarity as to what happens with those resources in a global setting. There is still hesitation in terms of supporting that kind of venture. And I think that's a challenge, because going forward, I would argue that the space economy will not just be about Earth orbit or support to Earth, it'll go out to space, right? And so without very clear guidance as to what that would mean regulatory, there could be that unpredictability, and that can not be very good for commercial space sector. I'll end by saying that at the level of the United Nations Legal Subcommittee, there is a conversation ongoing on building some principles that nations can abide by in terms of space resources, but that would require consensus. And we should have some level of clarity, say in the next 2 to 3 years, which would create much more predictability.
So how can countries then balance military and commercial interests in space?
So there are two ways to balance that, right? So first thing is that why are you building your space power capability? Right? Not all nations are investing in military space capability. So among the 76 nations, I would argue that there are, I can count them on my fingertips, right? About 9 or 10 that are actually building a military space capability and then offering that to their partner nations or allies, right? And so one, of course, is the United States, a very clear example. The US Space Force and the United States declared space a warfighting domain. China has been very bullish about its military space capability as well. In its 2021 military strategic guideline document that they issued, they say that space is the high ground for competition. And India also is starting to talk about that. Japan has established their space structure. So one way that nations are balancing it is very interesting. They are starting to build a framework where they are, especially countries like the US, India, Japan, South Korea, the European Union countries, they are very clearly telling the world that this is our military space institutional structure and this is our commercial. Sometimes we sign memorandum of understandings with our commercial space sector where we identify certain very key technologies that support our military space capability. For example, the US Space Force and the Department of Defense issued 2 documents which the commercial space sector will find very interesting. They're called the Commercial Integration Strategy. So they identify the technologies that they are looking for in the commercial space sector and they might fund that. India has also identified 75 different technologies for military space through their defense space capability. And so has Japan through its national security strategy. China is an interesting example here. So what China is doing is that in 2015, around 2014, 2015, it issued a document through their state council that identified what it was looking for in the commercial space sector. But then they're also, interestingly, highlighting what capabilities they look for in the private space sector that they will fund and help, what kind of capability they're building, for example, through their civil military fusion. So that's how nations are balancing it. The only interesting uniqueness of the space domain is that because we are not sure. So, for example, if you have a satellite in low Earth orbit or sun synchronous orbit, where most of the ISR satellites are, we do not know if that satellite is a military satellite or a commercial satellite. Sometimes
Right.
nations do not register that, right? And the dual purpose, which most people have pointed out, could be an issue in space.
How do you see the role of some of the emerging space nations in this global new space economy?
So the role of emerging space nations are going to be extremely important, for example, in legitimizing, one, some of the activities of the major powers, right? So for example, the US established under the first Trump administration through Space Policy Directive in 2017, the Artemis program, right? And the Artemis Accords. This is an accord that builds principles to go and explore and exploit resources on the moon. So one thing that emerging nations do is that when they sign on to the Artemis Accords, they actually offer their support and legitimacy to the US-based space order on the moon. China has its own structure, the International Lunar Research Station, and emerging nations might take a decision to join the Chinese-led lunar order, right? So that's what emerging nations are vital. Because space is so global in its effects, and because space has such global reach, the support of emerging nations are extremely vital. Second, in terms of the space economy, what emerging nations are doing is that they are building a model that actually, first of all, encourages their own communities and societies to build capability that affects their economic development overall. So, for example, nations in Africa are investing in remote sensing, for example, weather forecasting, communication, their own institutional structure, so that their overall economy is supported by the space economy in 2063. They have a long-term goal. A nation, for example, an emerging nation in Asia, say Malaysia or Indonesia, what they're doing is that to support the global space economy, they are offering their advantageous geographic position. For example, Indonesia, close to the equator, which means that they're trying to tell the world that, hey, if you build commercial and support commercial ports in our nation, you will have a much fuel efficient launch to space because of our position. So that's what emerging countries are doing. And then finally, to help the commercial sector, they're also playing a very critical and very active role at the UN to build those predictive structures that help the commercial space sector.
Just a couple of more questions, Namrata. And I'm thinking about the Starlink being made available to Ukraine for communications during the conflict that's going on there. And that kind of begs the question about the impact that space activities, particularly commercial space activities, will have on global security. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, so this is something that has been recognized across the world, right? So what you pointed out in terms of Starlink and Ukraine, and it's a established case now that when Russia targeted the Viasat. So the interesting thing that people sometimes don't know is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 started with a first shot in regard to space capability, which was commercial, which was Viasat modems. They targeted that through cyber attacks so that the Ukrainian military and personnel do not have access to that kind of communication, right? And then Starlink, basically, that had a contract with Ukraine to support humanitarian activities, stepped in. And so there is a whole discourse on that. So what is happening is that because of the growing role of the commercial space sector in terms of military power projection, data integration, mapping of battlefield in integration with artificial intelligence, for example, using satellite data, predicting where military deployment focus is. Nations are now pointing out that, hey, the commercial space sector will play a very critical role in terms of imagery, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance communication. And so what they're doing is that they're actually supporting the development of their own commercial space sector for military purposes. And then I'll end with the example of China. So there is a very interesting research report from the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force that is, of course, now built into the People's Liberation Army Aerospace Force. So they changed their structure a little bit this year actually, sorry. And so my point is that what they did is that in April 2024, around that time, they recognized that, well, commercial space activism in the US is going to very much help US military deployment, including partners and allies. So then they realized that, well, we need to build our own space institutional structure that is very super specialized and uses commercial space activity. So in April, President Xi argued that, well, we need to have new institutional structures that totally focuses on space. And so they established their aerospace force, and they argue that, well, very similar to what is happening in the world, we need to have counter space capabilities that are using commercial effects for system level capability. So yeah, that's how it's going forward.
To the extent that you can, talk with me about any recent developments or trends in space policy that you're seeing that are particularly significant.
Yeah, so in terms of space policy, so what does space policy do? First of all, space policy does three things. One is that it identifies a problem area that needs to be developed, that is missing, for example, in the space domain. Second, it then builds the institutional level policy to support that. And finally, it brings along the funds. The US has a particular cycle, China has a particular cycle, but the State Council does it. India, it's the Department of Space, right? For the US, Congress has to support such an activity through funding. And so what I'm noticing are two interesting trends in that regard. One is that there is a recognition in the world that space is going to be utilized not just for civilian inspirational exploration purposes, but also military support and communication. And so what is fascinating is that they have recognized a very critical technology that is going to be vital if you want to, for example, China wants to establish space superiority and space control in low Earth orbit, right? Or geosynchronous orbit. One thing that we do not really have is maneuver in space, right? Because delta V is expensive, and delta orbital mechanics is such that you have to really understand the space domain to do it well. So they have demonstrated this year a capability through their satellites that maneuver is possible. And so that is out in open source. They have discussed it very openly. Second thing that has happened is that if you really think about becoming a spacefaring civilization, you will need to have choke points and the ability to refuel in space.
Right.
I mean, the very reason that we are able to do this long distance strategic bombing or strategic deployment for the Air Force is that, especially the US Air Force or the Chinese Air Force, is that you have refueling, right? You can do refueling in the air. So very similarly in space, extension of the life of a satellite, maneuver, including rockets, you'll need refueling. And then you'll need certain areas that you can then land, like choke points, for example, islands in the Pacific, right? So similarly, the moon is seen as a choke point. You can build the capability there. And that's something I'm seeing develop, which is really fascinating, is that nations are starting to build in-service, on-orbit assembly and refueling and service. China has a big program on that, and they have demonstrated that through the Sijuang 25 satellite, and then identifying choke points in terms of space policy. So now the problems are identified, the funding is there. The most important thing is to mature those capabilities.
Dr. Goswami, I feel like I've gotten an opportunity to audit your class without paying Johns Hopkins tuition, and I don't have to take a test, which I'm very happy about. But thank you so much for joining me. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom. It's a pleasure, and you ask very interesting and insightful questions.
Well, I'll take that as, I'm sure, the compliment that it was intended. Great to see you again, Namrata. That's going to do it for this edition of the Terra podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any of our podcasts or any of our other videos. You can get daily updates on space commerce by subscribing to the Journal of Space Commerce on Substack at www.xterrajsc.com. And be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on X at xterrajsc. And please consider becoming a paid subscriber. Whether you're a space professional or an enthusiast, paid subscribers have first access to premium articles and podcasts focused on the new space economy. Just visit xterrajsc.com and help keep the Journal of Space Commerce independent as we chronicle, cajole, and when necessary, critique the commercial space industry. I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.
I wanna go faster, faster. Hands in the air, we're gonna crash. searching for the answers. Like Galileo, the proof is looking glass. That's for reason. A dreamer's eyes we gaze into a sense of purpose known by few. Like finding water on the moon.